Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove said when Hannah Clarke walked past him in the hallway on her first day. 5 years ago now. She didn't flinch. She didn't answer. She kept moving toward the supply closet like he hadn't spoken at all, and that small refusal to react would become the first mistake of his career, though he wouldn't understand it for months. He had no idea who was walking away from him. He had no idea that the trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind only men and women trained to operate behind enemy lines could manufacture at will. Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah sat on Abercorn Street like a beige monument to suffering. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed at precisely 60 hertz, a sound that never stopped, a sound that became the heartbeat of anyone who worked there long enough. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical bite of bleach and floor wax mixed with something organic underneath it, something that no amount of cleaning could remove. It was the smell of 5 years of Hannah Clarke's silence, of her hands moving through the ER with the economy of someone trained to work in absolute darkness, trained to find a vein in a casualty's arm during a firefight while rounds punched through drywall behind her head. She'd been at Sacred Heart since the Pentagon's people had told her to disappear. Told her to vanish. Told her that the classified operations in Ramadi, the ones where she'd performed surgery in a basement under artillery fire, where she'd extracted a bleeding 7-year-old boy from collapsing concrete, where she'd held together men whose bodies had been split open by shrapnel, those operations never happened. There was no record. No file. No proof. She'd been erased so completely that even her own service record had been redacted beyond recognition. They'd given her a new social security number, a new name possibility, and a quiet instruction: go work somewhere nobody asks questions. Nursing, they'd suggested. Hospitals are full of people with missing pieces. Hannah had chosen Savannah because it was humid and far from the ocean, which meant it smelled nothing like the Persian Gulf. She'd chosen Sacred Heart because the job posting asked for experience with trauma cases and didn't require a background investigation beyond what the government had already scrubbed clean. 5 years she'd been here. 5 years of keeping her eyes down, her voice soft, her past locked behind a surgical mask and steady hands that never shook. The morning that changed everything started like every other morning, for 41 a.m. alarm, the ritual of standing in front of the mirror for exactly 90 seconds, the small scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline barely visible unless the light caught it at the wrong angle. A souvenir from Ramadi. A souvenir from a life that officially never happened. She dressed in her scrubs, the one she'd pressed the night before with military precision, hospital corners on her bed like a barracks inspection. The fabric was soft from 5 years of washing, but her movements remained rigid, economical, the movement of someone who'd learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and adrenaline. The faded unit patch was sewn into the lining of her jacket that morning, like it had been every morning for 5 years. The stitching was careful, precise, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The patch itself was barely larger than a postage stamp, cloth worn nearly white, the letters and insignia so faded they looked like ghosts of symbols. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, though that name didn't exist on any official roster anymore. The patch was the only physical proof that she'd ever been real, ever been trained, ever held the rank that meant something in the darkness of classified operations. She touched it once, standing alone in her apartment, her fingers tracing the nearly invisible stitching. The muscle memory was instant, the way her breathing slowed, the way her shoulders squared, the way her entire nervous system shifted into a different frequency. Then she breathed out, let her shoulders drop, and became Hannah Clarke, the quiet nurse, once again. Sacred Heart's ER smelled like chaos even at 6:15 a.m. Breakfast trays rattled down the hallway. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from Trauma Bay 2. Nurses moved between stations with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to care for the dying while also caring deeply about getting everyone's morning medications distributed on schedule. Hannah clocked in at the time clock by the break room, her name appearing on the digital display in white letters. Clarke, H shift, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. She'd worked this shift for 5 years. Consistency. Predictability. Never a day off, never a reason to be memorable. That's when Dr. Hargrove first noticed her during morning rounds. He was chief of surgery, a man whose presence made the air pressure change, who walked through the hallways like he owned them, which, in some sense, he did. Hargrove had been at Sacred Heart for 13 years, long enough to know every board member's golf handicap, long enough to understand which administrators would look the other way when billing codes got inflated, long enough to establish a network of suppliers and consultants who understood the value of a well-placed kickback. He'd built a lucrative side business in the margins of legitimate medicine. Surgical equipment orders that mysteriously cost 15% more than competitor quotes. Billing codes that shifted routine procedures into specialty categories. Consultant fees paid to companies whose only employee was Hargrove's brother-in-law. Nothing crude. Nothing that would trigger an audit. Just the slow, steady extraction of money from a system designed to save lives. He was standing at the nurse's station reviewing a post-op chart when Hannah approached with a fresh set of vitals for one of his patients. A 67-year-old male, appendectomy, post-op day 2, recovery proceeding normally. She handed him the chart without speaking, and Hargrove noticed immediately her handwriting was straight as rifle sight lines. Each letter perfectly formed, each vital sign written with the kind of precision that belonged in a military hospital, not a civilian facility in Savannah. The numbers were there before he asked for them. BP 118/74. Heart rate 72, regular. O2 sat 96 on room air. Temperature 98.6. Like she'd anticipated every piece of information he might need and had already delivered it. He looked at her face then, really looked at her, and saw the scar. Thin line, nearly invisible, temple to jawline. The kind of scar that came from something sharp moving very fast. He'd seen similar scars on trauma surgeons who'd worked in field hospitals, on soldiers who'd come back from Iraq, on people who'd spent time in places that didn't appear on civilian maps. She was young for the competence she carried. Mid-40s, maybe. Fit in a way that civilians didn't achieve at the gym. Hands calloused at the fingertips in a pattern consistent with someone who'd handled weapons or done repetitive tactical work. Eyes that made contact without blinking, without the social hesitation that came from a normal life. During rounds, Hargrove watched Hannah reposition a post-op patient using perfect body mechanics, her movements economical and practiced. The patient, an older woman post-op from a major repair, was difficult, in pain, confused from the morphine, anxious about the lines and tubes. Hannah's hands moved like she'd done this 10,000 times, which she probably had. She never rushed. She never used more force than necessary. She explained what she was doing in a low, steady voice that had nothing to do with bedside manner and everything to do with issuing instructions to someone who needed to understand their role in a process that was already moving forward. The other nurses deferred to her instinctively. He'd noticed that over 5 years. New staff came in, and within weeks they were asking Hannah questions, waiting for her approval, treating her like she held rank. That bothered him. After rounds, Hargrove returned to his office and pulled her complete personnel file from the hospital's records system. Hannah Clarke. Start date, 5 years ago. Education, Bachelor of Science in Nursing from a school in D.C. Licensed practical nurse for 12 years prior, a 12-year gap that made no sense. No employment during those years, no explanation, no reference letter that specifically addressed the gap. References were sparse. A former supervisor from Walter Reed Military Medical Center who'd written only 2 sentences, excellent technical skills. Recommended for any position. Nothing else. No phone number. No willingness to elaborate. Like someone had been instructed to verify her credentials but nothing more. He pulled up her social media. Nothing. No Facebook, no Instagram, no LinkedIn profile, no digital footprint. People didn't live like that anymore. People documented their lives online automatically, without thinking. The absence of it meant she'd actively deleted it, or it had never existed because part of her life required invisibility. He made 3 phone calls that afternoon. First to Gerald Bennett, the board chairman. Then to Catherine Moss, the hospital administrator. Then to a consulting firm he knew that specialized in background investigations. He didn't explain much. just that he had concerns about a staff member's credentials, and he wanted a thorough vetting. He asked about her employment history, her professional affiliations, anything unusual. The investigator on the phone had gone quiet for a moment, and then said, "That's a name we should probably leave alone, Dr. Hargrove. Certain agencies prefer that kind of quiet." But he'd already committed to the course of action. That evening, Hargrove sat in a staff lounge alone for a moment, just before the night shift came in and the space filled with the sounds of microwave beeps and refrigerator doors opening. The room smelled like old coffee and someone's pasta dinner from lunch. He pulled out a $50 bill and laid it flat on the table. Then he waited for the first person to notice. Within minutes, 2 junior residents wandered in, followed by a surgical tech, followed by Dr. Miranda Santos, the only other female attending physician on staff. She saw the bill and raised her eyebrows. $50 as the new nurse quits within a week, Hargrove announced. Easy money. He was smiling when he said it. The kind of smile that made the room temperature drop a few degrees. The kind of smile that meant something else was happening underneath the surface, something that had nothing to do with a casual bet between colleagues. No one took the bet immediately. They'd all worked with Hargrove long enough to know that his propositions usually had teeth. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Santos asked, but she was backing toward the door. She knew something was coming. The quiet one. Clarke. She won't last. People like that, people with something to hide, they don't belong here. Too much scrutiny. Too many questions. I'll file a complaint with administration about her credentials by Friday. She'll feel the pressure, realize she's not safe, and she'll run. He leaned back in his chair with the certainty of someone who'd already calculated every variable. She looks like a nurse. She works like a nurse. But something's not right. And when I start digging, when I start asking the questions that make people uncomfortable, she'll disappear just like she disappeared before. The fluorescent light above the lounge table buzzed and flickered, and for just a moment, the room went dark. The fluorescent light above the lounge table buzzed back to life, casting the same sterile glow across the same laminate surface where Dr. Hargrove was already assembling an audience. He'd slapped a $50 bill on the table that morning, right in front of the surgical residents, right where Hannah could hear from the hallway while she restocked the crash cart with fur tubing and gauze packs. "I'll bet anyone here that Nurse Clarke quits within a week," he'd announced, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never experienced actual consequences. "She's got that look. The broken ones never last." Hannah's hand had paused on a package of fur tubing for exactly 2 seconds before continuing her work. That was yesterday. Today was the cafeteria. The lunch rush was in full chaos, 200 conversations colliding, trays clattering, the smell of industrial meatloaf mixing with the copper tang of antiseptic that never quite left Sacred Heart's ventilation system. Hannah carried her tray past the surgical resident's table, moving with the measured efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate crowded spaces without drawing attention. Her peripheral vision caught Hargrove's foot extending toward her path a half-second before impact, but not early enough to react without making it obvious. The tray flipped. Soup and coffee exploded across the tile floor in a cascade that silenced 200 conversations like someone had hit a mute button on the world. Hargrove looked up from his phone, his face arranged in an expression of mock concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Careful, sweetheart. Can't have clumsy hands in my ER." The room held its breath. Hannah took one measured breath, the kind of breath trained into her body during combat medicine training, the kind that brought oxygen to the brain and clarity to the nervous system. Her gaze tracked the soup spreading across the floor, and she watched how it moved on the tile exactly like blood moving across concrete. She'd seen that pattern before. Many times. In places that didn't exist on any map. A single tear escaped her left eye, tracing the thin scar that ran down the right side of her jawline. The scar itself was unremarkable, the kind of scar any ER nurse might accumulate over 5 years of work. Nobody here knew it came from shrapnel during a classified operation in Ramadi that had officially never happened, that had required her complete erasure from every military record. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact, her jaw remaining perfectly level. When she spoke, her voice came out steady as a rifle barrel, each word precisely measured. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor, in places where mistakes actually mattered." The silence stretched another half-second. Then Hargrove's face darkened, not the flush of embarrassment, but the cold red of a man who understood he'd failed to break something he was certain was already broken. He turned back to his phone without responding, which was its own admission. Hannah bent down, using napkins to contain the spill, her movements controlled and efficient. The residents around her suddenly became very interested in their salads, very absorbed in their phones, very committed to the pretense of not witnessing anything at all. She stood, tray in one hand, and moved toward the trash with the kind of grace that comes from having spent years moving through spaces under active fire. That was Thursday. By the following Thursday, Hargrove had escalated. The ER during shift change was controlled chaos, 37 beds, nurses charting furiously before handing off to the night shift, doctors reviewing case files, the overhead lights creating a fluorescent brightness that made everything look slightly artificial. Hannah was at the nurse's station reviewing Mrs. Patterson's pain management protocol when Hargrove appeared beside her, holding a patient chart. He didn't speak. He simply dropped it at her feet, papers cascading across the polished counter and onto the floor in a deliberate shower of white. The entire ER registered the movement. Every conversation shifted. Every head turned just slightly, the way prey animals orient toward a predator. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his tone now laced with open contempt. "Maybe if you spent less time playing hero and more time doing your actual job, Mrs. Patterson wouldn't be complaining about her pain management." The accusation was calculated. Mrs. Patterson had explicitly praised Hannah's attentiveness that morning, had written a compliment to the nursing supervisor about how thorough and kind Hannah had been during her post-operative assessment. Hargrove didn't care about truth. He cared about the public performance of dominance. Hannah knelt, gathering the papers with hands that had reassembled field medical kits under mortar fire, hands that had held pressure dressings on femoral arterial bleeds while helicopters roared overhead, hands that had started fours in moving vehicles over rough terrain. Her fingers moved with absolute precision, each motion economical, each gesture controlled. She gathered every sheet of paper, stacked them into a neat pile, and tapped them twice against the edge of the counter to align them perfectly. Then she stood, holding the chart at her side, and met Hargrove's eyes. "I've picked up men twice your size from battlefields you couldn't imagine, Doctor," she said quietly. "This is nothing." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The charge nurse, Maria, a 15-year veteran with the kind of unshakable competence that came from surviving hospital politics, heard them anyway. So did the resident to her left. So did the trauma surgeon at the far end of the station. So did 3 patients' family members in the nearby waiting area. The statement wasn't a defensive reaction. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of absolute certainty that made people unconsciously reassess their assumptions about the person delivering it. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make him look smaller. He turned and walked away, his pace just slightly faster than casual, which meant Hannah had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. She'd made him feel exposed in front of his own domain. The ER resumed its controlled chaos, conversations restarting, focus shifting back to monitors and medications and the endless rotation of human suffering that required managing. But the damage was being calculated in real time. Hannah's fingers found the outline of the unit patch through her scrub jacket, the small shape of fabric sewn into the inside of the lining, hidden from view. Faded colors. Unit designation. The last physical connection to a life that officially didn't exist. She could feel it there beneath the cotton, and the feeling steadied something in her chest that had begun to fracture under the sustained pressure of Hargrove's campaign. Maria touched Hannah's shoulder as the shift wrapped. "Why do you let him do this to you?" The question was asked with genuine concern, with the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd watched bullying play out in hospitals for 15 years and understood the calculus of survival it required. Hannah's eyes moved to the window overlooking the parking lot, where rain had begun to fall in the way that Georgia rain falls, sudden, heavy, uncompromising. "Because walking away would be quitting," she said finally. "I don't quit." It was a simple statement, but something in the way she said it, something in the absolute absence of doubt or resignation, made Maria understand that she was looking at someone who had walked through experiences that had fundamentally reordered her understanding of what quitting actually meant. This wasn't the resilience of someone trying to survive a difficult job. This was the resilience of someone who'd been trained to function in situations where failure meant death. The comparison to her current situation was so vast that it seemed to strip the job itself of its power. The following shift brought new complications. Hannah began noticing discrepancies during her meticulous charting, the same kind of careful attention to detail that had kept her alive in Ramadi, where one missed detail in a casualty report could mean a soldier's family didn't receive notifications, where one misplaced zero in a medical code could mean a patient's history was lost. A routine appendectomy showed post-operative charges for equipment that never appeared in the OR logs. A cholecystectomy for a 73-year-old woman included a line item for a surgical robot that Sacred Heart didn't even own. Another case showed charges for a 4.0 pediatric endotracheal tube when the patient was a 41-year-old male. She kept a private notebook, cross-referencing billing codes with actual procedures, her Special Forces intelligence training activating instincts she'd buried for 5 years. That was when Hargrove's expression changed from casual cruelty to something far more dangerous, calculated fear. He noticed her attention, saw her comparing surgical reports to billing statements during her lunch break in the AS back office, watched her photographing documents with her personal phone. Fear in a predator is the moment the predator becomes most dangerous. Within 48 hours, he'd called an emergency meeting with Hospital Administrator Dalton and 2 board members he'd cultivated through 5 years of golf outings and campaign donations. He'd brought with him a fabricated incident report on Hannah Clarke, 3 patient complaints that never happened, 2 medication errors that existed only in his documentation, 1 inappropriate interaction with a family member that he'd invented from whole cloth. The administrator nodded slowly. "Build the file. If there's a 4th incident, we have grounds for termination." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Meanwhile, the young man was already in transit. A 27-year-old Army Ranger named Marcus Webb had been stabbed during a bar fight outside Atlanta, the blade penetrating his chest cavity in a way that made the EMT's voices tight over the radio. Penetrating chest trauma. Possible cardiac involvement. ETA 12 minutes. Hannah heard the call and felt something shift in her body, not premonition, but the combat medic's instinct that never truly left, the part of her nervous system that understood, without language, that this one would test everything she'd trained to become. She began preparing the trauma bay with the efficiency of someone who'd done it in the back of moving helicopters, in vehicles traversing hostile territory at 40 miles per hour over terrain that was actively trying to kill you. She laid out instruments in the exact order she'd need them, positioning the monitor in her line of sight, ensuring the crash cart was within immediate reach, running through the mental checklists that had kept soldiers alive when modern medicine was still 20 minutes away by helicopter. Her hands moved through muscle memory that transcended 5 years of civilian work, that reached back to the part of her training that recognized that the next 10 minutes would either save a life or mark another failure, and that failure in this moment meant someone's family receiving a knock on their door. The morning rounds had ended 20 minutes ago, and Hannah stood alone in the medication station, reviewing the post-operative charts with the methodical precision that had kept soldiers alive in field hospitals. Her eyes traced the surgical reports, equipment lists, procedure times, anesthesia logs, cross-referencing each notation against the billing summaries that had arrived in her inbox that morning. Something didn't align. It never did, she'd learned, when money was involved. Patient 4782. Knee arthroscopy. The OR log listed a single-use arthroscopic shaver, model ASR 2400, serial number recorded, timing documented at 2:14 p.m. on Tuesday. She pulled the billing statement. The charge code showed 3 shavers billed, 3 separate line items at $4,200 each. The anesthesia record bore only 1 surgeon's signature. 1 procedure. 3 charges. The numbers had a way of lying when people believed no one was watching closely enough. She'd learned that watching closely was survival. In Ramadi, the difference between an ambush team and a medical supply convoy was often nothing more than noticing which vehicles didn't belong on which routes, which soldiers carried ammunition in patterns that didn't match their unit designation, which shadows moved against the direction of wind. Attention to detail kept you breathing. The same attention, applied to a hospital billing database, revealed that Sacred Heart's surgical department was bleeding money in patterns that looked deliberate. Hannah opened her notebook, not the official charting system, but the small leather journal she kept in her locker, a habit from years of documenting field observations that never made it to official channels. She recorded dates, patient identifiers, equipment codes, billing charges. Her handwriting was steady, surgical in its precision. Column A, what the OR log showed. Column B, what the invoices claimed. Column C, the difference in dollars. The discrepancies grew across weeks like a pattern in desert sand that only became visible when the sun hit it at the right angle. The billing office was 3 floors down, accessible from the back stairwell. She'd walked past it 100 times in 5 years without ever stopping. Today she slowed her pace as she descended, her footsteps echoing against the concrete steps in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Down. 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 The basement-level hallway smelled like old paper and photocopier ink, the smell of institutions keeping their secrets in filing cabinets and password-protected servers. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding what it meant. If someone was billing for equipment that never entered an operating room, the money had to go somewhere. Equipment didn't vanish. It was either sold elsewhere, diverted to private clinics, or existed only as numbers on screens. Those 3 options meant 3 different categories of people were involved. Administrative staff. Supply chain managers. Surgeons. The fraud didn't require just one corrupt doctor. It required a network. A system. Hannah had infiltrated systems before. She'd studied organizational structures in foreign countries, identified supply lines, mapped networks of people moving money and weapons through channels that looked legitimate to anyone not trained to see the distortions. This was smaller. Civilian. But the underlying architecture was the same. She didn't descend to the billing office. Not yet. Not without understanding who else knew. That same afternoon, Dr. Marcus Hargrove sat across from Rick Saunders in the hospital billing office, a utilitarian space with grey filing cabinets and a desk that bore the accumulated weight of 3 years of quarterly reports. The door was closed. The blinds were drawn. Saunders spread the latest audit results across the desktop, a spreadsheet showing medtech supplies invoices cross-referenced against payment receipts, and beneath that, a separate column showing the amounts that had flowed into a medical equipment consulting firm that didn't actually exist. The Clarke woman, Saunders said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone with authority. He was in his 60s, built like someone who'd played football in college and never stopped being the biggest person in the room. She's been accessing billing databases. Asking about post-op equipment inventory. If she connects the dots. She won't, Hargrove interrupted, but his jaw tightened. He knew better. A nurse who spent 5 years maintaining perfect work performance didn't suddenly start asking administrative questions unless she'd already seen something. But you're right. We need to contain this. He'd built his entire financial operation on the assumption that no one in Sacred Heart's hierarchy would scrutinize the supply chain closely enough. Surgeons had always been treated like gods in hospital hierarchies, their decisions unquestioned, their judgment assumed infallible, their billing patterns never audited because auditing a surgeon meant implying he'd made errors. And if you implied error, you implied potential liability. Easier to pay the bills and move forward. But a nurse who'd spent 5 years studying systems, who moved through the hospital like someone mapping terrain, who possessed the kind of cold competence that made surgeons feel less necessary in the room, that was a different problem entirely. Hargrove picked up his phone. The first call went to Dr. Reynolds at the VA hospital in Charleston, where Hannah had listed her previous employment on her application paperwork. He identified himself as Dr. Hargrove, Chief of Surgery at Sacred Heart, conducting a reference check on a former colleague. His voice modulated into the tone of a man expressing concern rather than accusation. I just want to understand her performance history, he said. There are some unusual gaps in her work record here. Personnel-wise. Are there issues I should know about? Reliability concerns? Any disciplinary matters that might not be documented? Reynolds, hearing the careful phrasing, heard what Hargrove had actually asked, is this person a problem? Would you recommend I remove her? Hargrove listened to 3 minutes of administrative non-answers, which confirmed what he needed to know, that Hannah had left the VA under circumstances that remained professionally obscured. Which meant there was something to find. The second call went to Janet Moreau, a board member whose husband's post-operative complications 2 years ago had required some creative documentation. Hargrove had protected the family from the reality of surgical error, burying inconsistencies in anesthesia records and charting notes that ultimately resolved in legal silence and financial settlement. Janet owed him. He activated that debt with careful language. I'm reaching out regarding some personnel matters, he said. There's a nursing employee whose performance is raising concerns about protocol compliance. I'm going to need board-level support as we address this situation. I wanted to ensure I had backing before proceeding with any formal actions. Janet understood immediately. In hospital politics, protocol compliance concerns meant I need this person gone and I need institutional coverage so there are no lawsuits. She confirmed her support within 8 seconds. The third call went to Compliance Solutions, an outside consulting firm that specialized in hospital investigations. He requested a formal review of emergency department nursing protocols, specifically focusing on medication administration oversight and unauthorized access to clinical systems. The request was casual enough to seem routine and specific enough to target Hannah directly. The fourth call was to David Chen in IT, whom Hargrove had hired 2 years ago when the previous director had retired. He'd made sure to approve Chen's hiring personally, to include him in several social events, to establish relationship capital. David, he said, I need a security audit of billing database access. Someone may have been pulling records without proper authorization. Can you run a report showing all nursing staff access to financial systems over the past month? By 3:16 p.m., Hannah had been called into HR. The HR director, Margaret Sullivan, had worked at Sacred Heart for 14 years, which meant she'd learned to recognize when she was being used as a tool rather than consulted for actual guidance. The file on her desk had grown substantially since that morning, containing notes from Dr. Hargrove, a request for investigation from Compliance Solutions, and an email from David Chen listing database access logs showing Hannah's user account accessing surgical billing records on 17 separate occasions. Hannah, Margaret said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script someone else had written, Dr. Hargrove has indicated some concerns about your scope of practice. He notes that you've been accessing systems outside your direct patient care responsibilities. Can you explain this? Hannah sat with her hands resting on her thighs, spine aligned with the chair back in the way military bearing creates even in civilian furniture. Her eyes were steady. Patient 4782 was listed as having post-operative complications during recovery, she said. I was verifying his insurance authorization for extended care. The billing department had listed equipment charges that didn't correspond to his procedure time, so I cross-referenced the documentation. It was true. The explanation was reasonable. Any competent nurse would do the same thing. But Margaret was reading from notes that cast the action as unauthorized, and the difference between a reasonable explanation and unauthorized access depended entirely on who was controlling the narrative. The notes here suggest you've been reviewing billing data repeatedly, Margaret said, not making eye contact, which meant she already knew what the decision had been made to be before this conversation began. That's outside your job description. It directly affected a patient's care, Hannah said. The response was measured, professional, the voice of someone defending a position rather than someone already defeated. I understand, Margaret said, and she probably did understand, which somehow made it worse. However, Dr. Hargrove has recommended that we limit your access to billing systems and restrict your scope of practice to direct patient care only. This will be noted in your personnel file as a scope of practice clarification. You're not being disciplined at this time, but we need to ensure you're operating within appropriate boundaries. The sound of Margaret's keyboard clicking as she typed the notation, 3 rapid taps, a pause, 3 more taps, was the sound of the first official record of Hannah being carved into institutional memory. Not an accusation. Not yet. Just a note. Scope of practice clarification. Language carefully chosen so that it didn't constitute a complaint but rather prepared the ground for future complaints to seem consistent with previous concerns. That evening, Hannah sat in her efficiency apartment, a sparse space containing a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and nothing else that suggested a person lived there. No photographs. No personal items. No evidence of life before Sacred Heart. She'd learned long ago that leaving a trail meant leaving a target. She opened the locked box from under the floorboards, the one that held the only physical proof she'd ever existed as someone other than a nursing employee. The Navy Cross lay on a bed of faded fabric, its blue ribbon still holding the precise creases from military presentation folds. She'd earned it in Ramadi, pulling 3 Marines from a burning Humvee while rounds impacted the road around her. She'd earned a Bronze Star for medical intervention during an ambush. 2 Purple Hearts, one from shrapnel in her left shoulder, one from a gunshot wound to her ribs that had somehow missed everything vital. The official record said she'd been killed in action during an IED explosion on March 15, 2009. Death benefits had been paid to the emergency contact she'd listed, an elderly aunt in Georgia who'd received the flag and the notification, who'd mourned the daughter of her late brother, who'd never known what her niece had actually become. Hannah removed the faded unit patch from the envelope beneath the medals. JSOC Task Force 121, the designation that had been redacted from every official record, erased from every computer system, transformed into a footnote in a classified file that would remain locked until decades after she was dead. The patch had been sewn into her original deployment jacket before she left for Ramadi. She'd kept it after the erasure, stitching it into the lining of every scrub jacket she'd worn since returning to civilian life. The military had ordered her to disappear after that operation went sideways, after the building collapse, after the 7-year-old boy had been pulled from rubble that wasn't supposed to collapse, after the mission had crossed into territory that the United States government couldn't acknowledge operating in. She'd been given a new identity in all but paperwork, told to integrate into civilian life, informed that her service had never happened. And she'd done it. She'd walked into Sacred Heart 5 years ago as just a nurse, and she'd maintained that facade with the discipline of someone trained to live undercover. No explanations. No references beyond the VA, where her records had been deliberately obscured. No connections to her previous life. But now someone was building a file against her, and she recognized the architecture of that work. It was the same technique used to discredit witnesses, to isolate assets, to create justification for removal. One notation in HR. Another from IT. A third from outside investigation. Each one alone meant nothing. Together, they created a pattern. Within 72 hours, they would complete the pattern. And when they did, Hannah Clarke would cease to exist in yet another way. The intercom crackled at 2:41 p.m. on a Tuesday. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. The paramedics wheeled Marcus Webb through the ER doors doing compressions, their rhythm mechanical and desperate, a man with a stab wound to the left anterior chest, blood already pooling on the stretcher. Hannah was in the medication room when the trauma alert sounded. She moved before conscious thought took over, muscle memory recognizing the tone and urgency in that single crackle of static. By the time Marcus hit the trauma bay, she was there. The paramedics called out vitals while transferring him to the hospital bed, blood pressure unobtainable, heart rate 140 and climbing, respiration shallow and labored. The attending, Dr. Hargrove, stood at the foot of the stretcher with his hands clasped in front of him, observing. One of the junior residents was already cutting away clothing, exposing the wound just below the left clavicle, a clean entry point that had violated the thoracic cavity. The chest tube tray was being prepped by the surgical tech, bottles of saline hanging like transparent sentries. Hannah looked at Marcus's neck and knew immediately what had happened before the monitors could confirm it. The external jugular veins were distended. Muffled heart sounds. Blood pressure dropping despite 2 large bore-pores running wide open. Cardiac tamponade. Blood was filling the pericardial sac, the membrane around the heart, squeezing his heart like an invisible fist, preventing it from beating effectively. Each compression the residents were performing was buying time measured in heartbeats. The room moved in controlled urgency, but it was the urgency of protocol, not of understanding. Of procedure, not of action. Hannah moved to the ultrasound machine and grabbed the probe. Dr. Hargrove noticed her motion and stepped toward the bed. Nurse Clarke, the cardiothoracic surgeon, is 10 minutes out. We need to stabilize and transfer. He'll be in full arrest in 3, Hannah said, not looking at him, already positioning the ultrasound transducer in the subxiphoid space. The screen flickered to life, showing a heart surrounded by dark fluid like a fist closing. The pericardial fluid was compressing the right atrium. This wasn't a problem that would resolve with chest tubes or time. This required a needle, precision, and hands that had learned the procedure in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled trauma bay. The pericardiocentesis kit was already on a nearby tray. Hannah opened it with movements that looked casual to anyone who hadn't trained for combat medicine. Sterile prep. Local anesthetic. 15-gauge needle. She felt Dr. Hargrove's presence like pressure, like someone standing too close in a hallway. Nurse Clarke, I'm ordering you to step back. That procedure is outside your scope of practice. Hannah was already angling the needle toward the left shoulder, advancing slowly beneath the xiphoid process, listening for the subtle resistance change that meant she'd penetrated the pericardial membrane. The ultrasound guided her path. Blood filled the syringe. The release was immediate, almost audible, like air escaping from something that had been holding its breath for too long. Marcus's heart rate dropped from the falsely elevated compression-induced rate to something closer to human. His blood pressure climbed on the monitor, 78/52. 84/58. 92/61. Color returned to his face like someone had switched on a light. A resident whispered, "How did she?" The cardiothoracic surgeon arrived 90 seconds later, took one look at the monitor, and said, "Who did the pericardiocentesis?" Hannah was already moving back, already removing her gloves, already becoming invisible again. The surgeon didn't wait for an answer. He took over, securing the needle, calling for an echo to guide definitive placement, preparing Marcus for the operating room. Hannah stepped out of the trauma bay and into the hallway where the fluorescent light seemed too bright, too steady, too neutral for what had just happened. She was washing her hands at the sink when she heard her name on the overhead intercom. Administrative offices. Now. Her hand stopped mid-wash. Water ran over knuckles that had been steady in a collapsing building under fire, steady while performing this same procedure with mortar rounds impacting 50 meters away, steady through 5 years of silence and service. She dried her hands slowly, deliberately, and walked toward the administrative wing with the same measured pace she'd used to cross open ground under sniper fire. The hospital administrator sat behind a mahogany desk with a folder in front of him. Dr. Hargrove stood to the left, his expression a careful mixture of concern and professional duty. The folder was thin, which meant it was new. Which meant it had been assembled quickly. The administrator, a man named Pierce with the kind of silver hair that came from generational wealth, opened it without preamble. We received a report regarding an unauthorized procedure performed in Trauma Bay 3 approximately 30 minutes ago. A pericardiocentesis, performed by nursing staff without physician supervision or approval. This represents a significant deviation from hospital protocol, and we have concerns about patient safety and scope of practice violations. Hannah stood in front of the desk with her hands at her sides. This was the moment. The moment when Dr. Hargrove activated whatever leverage he'd been gathering. She could see it in the way he wouldn't quite make eye contact, the way he allowed the administrator to do the talking. He'd already made his calls. She was certain of it. Within the hour, probably, he'd contacted the references she'd listed on her application 5 years ago. Probably he'd called the community college where she'd listed part-time work. Probably he'd already planted questions about gaps in her employment history, about the missing years, about how a nurse could have acquired skills like that without documented training. "I performed the procedure to prevent patient death," Hannah said. Her voice was flat. "Correct." Unapologetic. That may be true, the administrator said, but we have protocols for a reason. Medical procedures are the domain of physicians. A patient in your position with a stab wound should have been prepped for emergency surgery, not subjected to. Emergency pericardiocentesis for cardiac tamponade is a procedure taught in the Advanced Trauma Life Support Certification Program and the Pre-Hospital Trauma Life Support Protocol. It's within scope of practice for nurses operating in situations where physician intervention is not available or timely enough to prevent death. She'd recited it correctly, technically, without deviation. It didn't matter. She could see the calculation in the administrator's eyes. This wasn't about protocol. This was about Dr. Hargrove activating his network, making calls, building a case that had nothing to do with what she'd done and everything to do with what she was. We're going to conduct a formal investigation, the administrator said. Effective immediately, your credential badge is being deactivated. You're suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. Your employment status is on hold. The words arrived like distant thunder, like something that had been forecast but still managed to surprise. Hannah nodded once, a single acknowledged command, and turned to leave. The administrator called after her, something about not leaving hospital property, about access restrictions, about turning in her badge. She removed the badge from her lanyard and set it on his desk without stopping. Her hands were steady. She cleaned out her locker methodically. The personal stethoscope went into a cardboard box. The extra uniform scrubs, folded. The water bottle with her initials. Her hands moved from shelf to shelf like someone packing a field kit for extraction, like someone who'd done this before in hostile territory. The scrub jacket came last, the one with the unit patch sewn carefully inside the lining, the patch that connected her to 20 years and a name she wasn't allowed to claim. She folded it and placed it on top of the box. By 7 p.m., an investigator from an outside firm had arrived and was questioning her about employment gaps, about verification of references, about where exactly she'd worked during the 3 years before Savannah. Hannah sat in a small office and answered with the minimum required to follow regulation. Yes. No. That's correct. She couldn't defend herself. Any defense would require opening the vault, and the vault contained classification levels that would trigger protocols above this hospital administrator's pay grade. The vault contained Ramadi. The vault contained a 7-year-old boy carried from rubble. The vault contained the reason she was supposed to have disappeared completely, not just into a nursing career in Savannah. By 8 p.m., she was walking across the parking lot carrying the cardboard box, her credentials under formal review, her status suspended, her locker sealed. The early November air was cold enough to make her breath visible, small clouds of evidence that she was still breathing, still moving, still existing even though the hospital had officially erased her. 3 days passed in the quiet that comes from falling through institutional cracks. No phone calls. No emails. No one calling her back to work because she'd already been removed from the schedule. She used the time to process what it meant when an identity built over 5 years could collapse in 5 hours. The scrub jacket hung in her closet with the unit patch pressed against the inside of the lining like a secret that was becoming a curse. On the 4th day, she drove to the VA hospital across town and sat in the waiting room, surrounded by the particular exhaustion that comes from surviving things the world will never acknowledge. A Vietnam vet with a prosthetic leg nodded at the scar on her forearm. Ramadi, he asked. She couldn't answer. The question contained too much truth, required too many words that would break the carefully maintained silence. She shook her head and looked at the floor, watching her reflection in the linoleum tile, a ghost of someone who'd saved lives she couldn't claim and was now disappearing again, exactly as the Pentagon had intended, exactly as she'd always known would happen if the wrong person looked too carefully at her hands. What she didn't know was that Marcus Webb was still in Sacred Heart Hospital's intensive care unit, conscious now, healing, carrying a memory that had been waiting 20 years to be activated. What she didn't know was that he'd kept something all these years, a document that had taken his father 12 years to obtain through classified FOIA requests, a folder containing one name and one photograph, partially redacted, that showed a female Special Forces medic carrying a child from a collapsing building under fire. What she didn't know was that the moment he'd seen her face in that trauma bay, something had shifted in his brain, a synapse connecting across 2 decades, and he'd begun asking every medical professional within earshot about the scar on her left forearm, about the medic named Clarke, about whether anyone knew where she'd gone. Marcus Webb's eyes opened to the sound of the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, the same mechanical breath that had kept him alive through 12 hours of surgery and 17 units of blood. His vision cleared in stages, white ceiling tiles first, then fluorescent lights bleeding through his consciousness like a slow dawn. The ICU around him hummed with the quiet efficiency of machines doing the work his body couldn't yet manage. His throat felt like someone had sewn it shut with fishing line. His chest felt like someone had rebuilt it from salvage. And then he saw her face. The nurse moved through his field of vision with the kind of fluid precision that belonged nowhere near a civilian hospital. Her hands checked his full line, adjusted his monitor leads, scanned the infusion pumps with the focus of someone reading classified documents. Hannah Clarke. 7 letters he'd been carrying in a folder for 20 years, partially redacted, one photograph worn soft at the edges from the number of times his father had unfolded it. Female Special Forces medic. Building collapse. Ramadi. The pieces he'd been assembling his entire adult life were standing 2 feet from his bed in scrubs that said Sacred Heart Hospital. His lips moved before his brain caught up. The words came out as a whisper, cracked and barely audible, shaped by a throat that had been intubated just hours before. Senior Chief. The room went still. Hannah froze. Her hand stopped mid-motion on his full line, her eyes meeting his with the look of someone who'd just heard a word in a language she'd deliberately forgotten how to speak. For a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe an eternity, nothing moved except the machines. The heart monitor accelerated. The ventilator continued its mechanical rhythm. The 4-pump clicked softly as it delivered medication into his bloodstream. Hannah's jaw tightened. Just barely. The kind of clench that took 15 years of combat training to recognize. You need rest, Mr. Webb. No. His voice was paper-thin but absolute. No, you were there. The building came down and you pulled me out and your hands were shaking and there were shots and you told me to run. Hannah's hand moved to her badge. Not out of habit. Out of instinct. The gesture of someone suddenly aware that her entire identity had been condensed into a single moment of recognition from a stranger whose name she'd never known. Whose face she'd never forgotten. I need to call your care team, she said, but she didn't move. Marcus pushed against the pain in his chest, reached toward the bedside table with his left arm, the one with the full line, the one that moved like it belonged to someone else. His fingers found a manila folder, sealed with tape that had yellowed over 2 decades. I've had this since I was 7, he whispered. My father got it through FOIA requests when I turned 21. Pages and pages about the day I almost died. And there was a name. And a photograph. Redacted, but mostly there. Hannah watched him like she was watching a room fill with water. Female Special Forces medic, it said. Saved a child from a collapsing structure during Operation Matador, classified theater, Special Operations Command. Received commendation. Medic name, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Marcus's voice cracked. His hands trembled with the effort of holding the folder. That's you. It was always you. The ICU monitor beeped. A nurse from the station rushed in, checking the sudden elevation in heart rate. Hannah's face had become something carved from stone, no emotion, no reaction, just eyes that had seen too much and were now seeing too much again. The other nurse adjusted Marcus's sedation, asked him to breathe deeply, checked his oxygen saturation. The numbers climbed. 96, 97. 98%. When the nurse left, Hannah stood at the foot of his bed. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. That was a long time ago. I know. Marcus breathed through the pain in his sternum where the surgeon had cracked his ribs to perform the emergency thoracotomy. I know it was classified. I know you're not supposed to talk about it. But I'm telling you I remember. I remember your voice telling me to stay quiet. I remember the sound of gunfire. I remember you carrying me and your uniform was wet with blood and you kept running. You saved my life. You saved me. Hannah's hand found her jacket lining, the place where she kept the faded unit patch, the only physical thing tying her to the life she couldn't claim. Lot of people did a lot of things over there. A lot of things that don't have names anymore. Mine has a name. My name. Marcus's eyes held steady on hers. Marcus Webb. From Portland. Came back to Ramadi last year with my Ranger battalion and stood on that street and tried to remember exactly where the building had been. Tried to thank someone. But all I had was your name on a piece of paper and the memory of your face. The radio on Hannah's shoulder crackled with an incoming trauma alert. But she didn't move. Not yet. The moment held like a breath before water breaks the surface. Then the ICU charge nurse appeared at the door. Clarke, we need you in trauma. Stab wound, ETA for minutes, probable cardiac involvement. Hannah's eyes didn't leave Marcus's. Her voice dropped an octave. I'm on it. She was gone before he could respond, moving with that same fluid precision, that same absolute focus, but now it was different. Now it was visible. Now it was command. The door hissed shut behind her. 16 minutes later, she'd packed the stab wound with gauze after a 14-gauge needle angiocath decompression, stabilized the patient's blood pressure with 2 units of O negative, and called for an emergency OR consult. The surgeon, not Hargrove, thank God, one of the younger attendings, had looked at her across the trauma bay and said, "Where the hell did you learn that technique?" "Around," Hannah replied. Her hands were steady. Her voice was flat. "Let's move." But it wasn't the stab wound that changed everything. It was what happened 73 seconds after Marcus Webb whispered Senior Chief. A man in navy dress blue strode through the ICU automatic doors like he owned the building. Commander Jason Rourke. 6'3", scar tissue visible along his right temple, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change the moment he entered a room. Behind him came 2 other personnel in dress uniforms, navy brass, faces that belonged in Arlington, not in a civilian hospital in Savannah. The ICU charge nurse intercepted them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Looking for Hannah Clarke," Rourke said. "And Marcus Webb." "And Dr. Keith Hargrove." "Administration office." "Now." The charge nurse blinked. "I can find Ms. Clarke, but Dr. Hargrove is in surgery and—" "Then we wait for surgery to conclude," Rourke said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind of command that came from someone who'd given orders in places where hesitation meant body bags. "Find her. We have approximately 30 minutes. 23 minutes later, Hannah stood in the hospital administrator's office. Dr. Gerald Matthews sat behind his desk, looking like someone who'd been told the roof was collapsing. Dr. Hargrove had been extracted from the OR and was present via video conference on the administrator's laptop, still in surgical loops and a mask, confusion written across his face. And standing in front of the desk, in full dress uniform, was Commander Jason Rourke. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Rourke opened a classified briefing folder. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, methodical and unstoppable. "SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Ramadi, 2004 through 2006. Medical specialist attached to direct action raids. Commendation for Valor under fire. Bronze Star with Valor." He paused. The next words landed like artillery. "Silver Star." Another pause. Another name hung in the air like a ghost. "Silver Star for actions classified under Executive Order 13526. And—" He closed the folder. Opened his eyes to Hannah's. "Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations, February 2006, Fallujah. Classified." Hannah's jaw didn't move. Her hands didn't shake. But something in her eyes shifted, a recognition of a voice speaking truth she'd spent 20 years burying. Dr. Hargrove had gone pale on the laptop screen. His mouth moved but nothing came out. He'd been threatening a nurse. Bullying a nurse. Trying to break a nurse he had no idea was standing on the other side of the ocean from being the most decorated Special Forces medic in the entire command structure. Ms. Clarke is under federal protection due to classified operations, Rourke continued. Any investigation into her service record requires Joint Chiefs approval. Any interference with her employment constitutes obstruction of a national security matter. That's 18 U.S.C. 798, 50 U.S.C. 3024, and the Espionage Act if we're being thorough. The administrator's face had gone the color of old bone. I'm going to be very clear about what happens next, Rourke said. Ms. Clarke's suspension is rescinded immediately. Her personnel file is sealed. Any investigation is terminated. And any communication regarding her service history outside this room results in federal charges. The hospital administrator nodded. He nodded again. He couldn't seem to stop nodding. Then the door opened and 2 FBI agents entered with laptops and a portable hard drive. They didn't ask permission. They simply began speaking to Dr. Hargrove on the video screen with the kind of mechanical precision that meant warrants had already been served. Dr. Hargrove, we're here regarding allegations of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and falsifying medical records spanning the period of October 2019 to present. We have recovered deleted surgical billing files from your computer, corroborating evidence from MedTech Supply regarding kickback payments, and testimony from your IT specialist regarding the systematic deletion of patient records. The rest happened in layers, like watching an avalanche from a distance. Dr. Hargrove's face cycling through shock and denial. MedTech Supply had already flipped. The board members he'd cultivated were lawyering up. The consulting firm he'd brought in to destroy Hannah had withdrawn the moment the Department of Defense made 3 phone calls. His partnership was dissolved by 6 p.m. His medical license suspended by 7 p.m. His wife filed for separation by midnight. By dawn, Dr. Keith Hargrove had become a name attached to a federal booking number, 18 counts of fraud, a cell in county jail, and the sudden knowledge that he'd spent 6 months trying to destroy someone whose actual job involved operating in conditions he couldn't fathom. Hannah stood on the roof of Sacred Heart as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Commander Rourke was beside her, both of them silhouetted against the orange sky. Below them, the city of Savannah was settling into evening, the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks like the beards of old ghosts. The Navy wants you back, Rourke said. Training command. Teaching the next generation of Special Forces medics. You'd have your rank back. Your benefits. Your retirement. Hannah looked out over the city. Her unit patch, faded, worn, the colors bleeding at the edges, was now visible on her jacket lining, no longer hidden. I've been invisible for 20 years. You've been visible every single day, Rourke replied. Just in scrubs instead of fatigues. Same mission. Different uniform. Inside, on the 7th floor, Marcus Webb was being prepared for discharge. His family surrounded him, mother weeping, father shaking the hands of every medical professional he could find, 2 sisters alternating between laughter and tears as they finally understood why their brother had spent his entire adulthood searching for someone they could never even name. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.